The sky over Blackwell, Oklahoma had a strange color that afternoon in May of 1955. It was a pale green, the kind of green that old-timers said meant trouble. The air was thick and still, heavy with moisture, and the only sound was the hum of insects and the distant drone of farm machinery. People went about their business as usual, because that is what people do when they live in Tornado Alley. They keep an eye on the sky, sure, but they do not let the threat of a storm stop them from living. The town of Blackwell was a close-knit community, a place where everybody knew everybody else. It was a farming town, flat and spread out, with grain elevators rising above the rooftops like silent sentinels. The main street was paved, but most of the side roads were gravel, and the houses were modest frame homes with porches and shade trees. Families had lived there for generations, and the roots ran deep. On that Wednesday afternoon, the 25th day of May, the only thing on most people's minds was getting ready for supper and listening to the radio. But the radio would soon bring news that would change everything. The day had started off sunny and warm. By noon, the temperature had climbed into the 80s, and the humidity made the air feel like a wet blanket. Meteorologists at the Weather Bureau in Kansas City had been watching a storm system building over the Texas Panhandle. It was a classic setup for severe weather. Warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico colliding with dry air from the Rockies, and a strong jet stream overhead adding spin to the atmosphere. The conditions were ripe for supercell thunderstorms, the kind that could produce tornadoes. But in 1955, weather forecasting was not what it is today. There were no Doppler radars, no storm chasers, no cell phones with alerts. The only warning came from the sky itself and from the teletype machines that clattered in newspaper offices and radio stations. The Weather Bureau issued a severe thunderstorm watch early in the afternoon, but that was vague and often ignored. People were used to storms. They had seen plenty of them roll through, dumping rain and hail, then moving on. Nobody expected the monster that was about to be born. By mid-afternoon, the clouds began to build to the southwest. They were tall and dark, with a flat anvil top that spread out like a hand. A few people noticed the way the clouds were rotating slowly, almost lazily, but most were too busy to pay attention. The town of Blackwell had a population of about 7,000 at that time. It was a bustling little place with a cotton oil mill, a flour mill, and a few small factories. The streets were lined with businesses, hardware stores, grocery stores, drugstores, a movie theater, and a couple of cafes. There were churches on nearly every corner, and the schools had just let out for the summer. Kids were playing in yards, running through sprinklers, and riding bicycles. It looked like an ordinary day in an ordinary town, but the green sky was a warning that the ordinary was about to end. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, the first signs of severe weather appeared. The wind picked up, gusting from the south, then suddenly shifting to the west. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air took on a metallic smell. Hail began to fall, first small pellets, then pieces the size of golf balls. It pounded on rooftops and car hoods, a deafening drumbeat that made it hard to hear anything else. People ran for cover, some pulling their cars into garages, others gathering their children from the yards. The sky grew darker, turning from green to black, and then the hail stopped and there was a strange silence. That silence was more frightening than any noise. It was the calm before the storm, the moment when the air feels tight and heavy, when even the birds stop singing. In that silence, people looked to the southwest and saw it. A funnel cloud was descending from the base of the storm. The tornado touched down just southwest of town, near the small community of Tonkawa. It was a violent, wedge-shaped tornado nearly a mile wide at its peak. It moved northeast at about 35 miles per hour, chewing up the farmland and tossing tractors and trees like toys. The first sign of trouble for Blackwell was a telephone call from a farmer on the edge of town. He was shouting into the receiver, telling the operator that a tornado was coming, that it was huge, that they had to warn everyone. The operator relayed the message to the police station, where the chief of police immediately called the fire department and the newspaper office. The newspaper staff ran to the window and saw the dark, churning cloud approaching. One of them grabbed the phone and called the radio station, which was just a few blocks away. The radio station, KOME, was already on the air with regular programming. When the call came in, the announcer interrupted the music and shouted into the microphone, "There is a tornado on the ground heading straight for Blackwell. Take cover immediately." That announcement, that frantic warning, saved countless lives. But even with the warning, there was only about 10 minutes before the tornado hit. 10 minutes is not a lot of time when you have to get to a storm cellar or a basement. Not every house in Blackwell had a basement. Many homes were built on concrete slabs, and the only shelter was a closet or a bathtub. People did what they could. They grabbed their children, their pets, whatever was precious, and they ran. Some made it to the community storm cellar near the school. Others huddled in their bathrooms, pulling mattresses over their heads. A few jumped into ditches or drainage culverts. The police and firemen drove through the streets with sirens wailing, shouting through loudspeakers for everyone to get inside. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos because the people of Blackwell knew what to do. They had practiced tornado drills in school. They had heard the stories of other towns destroyed by twisters, but nothing can truly prepare you for the real thing. The tornado struck the southwestern edge of Blackwell at exactly 6 p.m. The first buildings it hit were the grain elevators and the cotton oil mill. The elevators, which stood tall and solid, were simply ripped apart. The concrete walls crumbled and the steel bins twisted like ribbons. The cotton oil mill exploded in a cloud of dust and debris. The roar of the tornado was now audible, a deafening, continuous rumble like a dozen freight trains running at full speed. It was a sound that people would remember for the rest of their lives, a sound that would haunt their dreams. The tornado moved northeast, plowing through the residential neighborhoods. It took out entire blocks of houses, leaving nothing but foundations and splintered wood. Cars were thrown into the air and tossed into trees. A school bus was lifted and dropped onto its side. The tornado did not discriminate. It destroyed the rich and the poor, the old and the new. It was a force of nature, blind and merciless. Inside the homes that were still standing, people felt the pressure drop. Their ears popped and the windows bowed inward. Then the windows shattered and the walls began to shake. Those who were in basements heard the roar above them, felt the ground tremble, and prayed. Some said they felt the house lift off its foundation, then slam back down. Others said they heard screams from neighbors that were cut short. The tornado was so wide that it covered most of the town. It was not a narrow rope of wind. It was a massive wall of destruction, a mile from side to side. It spent about 4 minutes in Blackwell, but those 4 minutes seemed like an eternity. When it passed, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of shock, of disbelief, of a town that had been turned upside down. People began to emerge from their shelters. They stepped out into a world that looked like a war zone. The streets were covered in debris, bricks, shards of glass, broken furniture, twisted metal, and tree branches. Some houses were gone, completely vanished. Others were leaning at odd angles, their roofs torn off, cars were overturned, and power lines were down, sparking and hissing. The air was filled with dust and the smell of natural gas. Somewhere a water main had burst and water was gushing into the street. People walked around in a daze, calling out for their loved ones. They searched through the rubble, hoping to find survivors. The first responders, the police and firemen, began to organize rescue efforts. They were joined by volunteers, ordinary citizens who grabbed shovels and started digging. It was a scene of immense devastation, but also of incredible resilience. In the middle of this chaos, there were stories of heroism and luck. A mother had covered her 3 children with her body in the bathtub, and all 4 survived. A man had taken shelter in his storm cellar just as the tornado lifted his house away, and he emerged to find nothing but sky above him. A dog was found sitting on a pile of rubble, waiting for its owner. A young boy was pulled from the debris of a collapsed school, unharmed except for a few scratches. But there were also stories of tragedy. 20 people died in Blackwell that day. Some were crushed by falling walls, others were struck by flying debris. One family of 4 was killed when their home was swept away. The oldest victim was 79, the youngest was just 2 years old. The tornado injured over 200 people, many of them seriously. The hospitals in nearby towns were overwhelmed with the wounded. As night fell, the search continued by flashlight and lantern. The Red Cross set up a temporary shelter in a school that had survived. The National Guard was called in to maintain order and prevent looting. The governor of Oklahoma declared Blackwell a disaster area. And in the days that followed, the country would learn about the Blackwell tornado. Newsreel cameras captured the destruction, and newspapers printed photographs that showed the full extent of the damage. It was one of the most powerful tornadoes ever recorded in Oklahoma, rated an F5 on the Fujita scale, with winds estimated at over 260 miles per hour. But for the people of Blackwell, those statistics meant little. What mattered was the loss, the grief, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding their lives. The opening segment of this story is about more than just the tornado. It is about the people who lived through it, the choices they made in those final moments of warning, and the courage they showed in the aftermath. It is about a town that was nearly erased from the map but refused to disappear. And it is about the power of a community to come together when everything around them has fallen apart. This is the story of the Blackwell tornado, a story of destruction, yes, but also a story of survival. We will take you through the events minute by minute, from the green sky that afternoon to the desperate rescue efforts that continued through the night. We will hear from the survivors, listen to their voices, and try to understand what it was like to face the fury of nature at its most violent. But before we go any further, let us pause for a moment and hold on to that image. A quiet town in the middle of the prairie, a town that was about to be changed forever. The tornado has passed and the people are emerging into the wreckage. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the ruins. The sound of sirens fills the air. And somewhere in the distance, a child is crying. This is where our story truly begins. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but the sky over Blackwell was still painted with a strange, unnatural glow. It was not the soft colors of a prairie sunset. It was the harsh light of fires burning in the rubble, the flicker of emergency vehicle lights, and the beam of flashlights cutting through the settling dust. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, gasoline, and something else that no one wanted to name. The town that had been a bustling community just an hour ago was now a landscape of twisted metal and broken concrete. The first rescuers moved through the debris with a grim determination, their voices hoarse from shouting for survivors. They worked in teams, each one assigned to a block, a street, a collapsed building. They listened for sounds beneath the wreckage, a knock, a cry, a whimper. And whenever they heard something, they dug with their hands if they had to, until they reached the person trapped below. One of the first rescues that night was a young woman named Martha who had been in her bedroom when the tornado struck. Her house was one of the few on her block that still had walls standing, but the roof was gone and the second floor had collapsed onto the first. She was pinned under a fallen beam, her leg trapped, but she was conscious. Her neighbors heard her screaming and crawled through the jagged opening where her front door used to be. They lifted the beam together, three men straining against the weight while a fourth pulled her out. She was bleeding, her leg was broken, but she was alive. They carried her to the street, where a makeshift triage center had been set up in the back of a pickup truck. Blankets were spread out on the truck bed, and volunteers with first aid training were doing what they could before the ambulances arrived. But the ambulances were overwhelmed, and many of the wounded had to be transported to hospitals in Ponca City and Tonkawa in private cars, in station wagons, in any vehicle that could move. The triage center was a scene of organized chaos. Doctors who had been off duty rushed to the scene, still wearing their civilian clothes. Nurses came from local clinics. They worked by flashlight, using torn sheets for bandages and splinting broken limbs with pieces of lumber. The most critical patients were loaded into ambulances and sent off into the night, their sirens wailing as they sped down roads that were littered with debris. Those with minor injuries were treated on the spot, given tetanus shots and stitches, and sent to find shelter wherever they could. The Red Cross had set up a canteen in a school gymnasium that had somehow survived the storm. They served coffee, sandwiches, and whatever else they had to the survivors who stumbled in dazed and covered in dust. The gymnasium was filled with people sitting on the floor, holding each other, crying, or just staring blankly at the walls. Children clung to their parents and parents clung to each other, grateful to be alive but terrified of what they might find when the sun came up. As the night deepened, the search continued. The National Guard arrived around midnight, bringing heavy equipment, floodlights, and more personnel. They set up a command post at the courthouse, which had survived with only minor damage. The Guard soldiers, many of them young men who had grown up on farms, looked at the destruction with a mixture of shock and duty. They had trained for emergencies, but nothing had prepared them for this. They were assigned to sectors, given maps that were now useless because the landmarks were gone, and told to go door to door or what was left of doors to account for every resident. The process was slow and heartbreaking. They found bodies in the rubble, some in their homes, some in the street, some in fields on the outskirts of town. Each discovery was marked with a flag, and the remains were carefully removed and taken to a temporary morgue set up in a local church. The morgue was a quiet place, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Volunteers, many of them elderly women from the church, prepared the bodies for identification. They washed the dirt and debris from the faces, combed the hair, and placed tags on the wrists. Family members were brought in to identify their loved ones, and the sound of grief filled the small chapel. There was a man who recognized his wife by the ring on her finger. There was a mother who identified her son by the jacket he was wearing, the one she had bought him for his birthday. There were those who never came because they themselves were among the missing, and their families were left to wonder, to hope, and to search through the piles of rubble that had once been their homes. Through all of this, the survivors kept telling their stories. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, a thread in the fabric of that terrible evening. There was the story of Harold, a farmer who had been in his barn when the tornado hit. He had no basement, so he lay flat in a ditch, covering his head with his arms. The wind tore the barn apart around him, and he felt debris flying over his back. When it was over, he stood up and found that his tractor had been thrown into a tree, but he was unharmed, not a scratch on him. He walked to town to help, and he spent the rest of the night pulling people from the wreckage. There was the story of Emily, a teacher who had stayed late at the school to grade papers. When the warning came, she herded the few students who were still there into the hallway, as they had practiced. The tornado ripped the roof off the gymnasium, but the hallway held. She and the students emerged to find the school in ruins, but they were safe. She was in shock, but she stayed with the children until their parents came. There was the story of two elderly sisters, Gertrude and Edna, who lived in a small house near the center of town. They had no basement, and when the warning came, they huddled in a closet, holding hands and praying. The house was lifted and thrown, and when it landed, the closet was the only room that remained intact. They were trapped inside, but they could hear each other and they knew they were alive. It took rescuers 4 hours to find them, but they were pulled out, shaken but unhurt. And there was the story of a young couple, Tom and Sarah, who had been married only a year. They took shelter in their bathroom, lying in the bathtub with a mattress over them. The tornado tore the house apart, but the bathtub stayed in place, bolted to the floor. They emerged to find their home gone, their car crushed, but they had each other. Sarah was crying and Tom held her, and they walked through the debris to find help. But not all stories had happy endings. There was the family of four who had been in their living room when the tornado hit. They had no warning because they were watching television and the power went out. They never made it to the basement. Their bodies were found in a field a quarter of a mile from where their house had stood. There was the elderly man who had refused to leave his home even when his neighbors begged him. He said he had survived the Dust Bowl and he would survive this. He did not. And there was the young girl who had been playing in her backyard when the sky turned green. Her mother called her inside, but it was too late. The tornado took her, and her mother spent the rest of the night searching, calling her name into the darkness. She was found the next morning in a ditch, still alive but unconscious. She woke up in a hospital days later, and when she asked about her mother, she learned that her mother had died in the storm while searching for her. These stories and hundreds more became the narrative of the Blackwell tornado. They were told and retold in the days and weeks that followed, in the shelters, in the newspaper articles, on the radio, and eventually in history books. They were the human side of the statistics, the faces behind the numbers. The official death toll was 20, but that number did not capture the grief of a town that had lost friends, neighbors, and family. The injured numbered more than 200, but that number did not capture the pain, the surgeries, the long recoveries. And the destroyed property was valued at millions of dollars, but that number did not capture the loss of a home, a lifetime of memories, a sense of security. The morning after the tornado brought a new challenge. The sun rose over a town that was barely recognizable. The light revealed the full extent of the damage. The grain elevators that had stood like sentinels on the edge of town were now piles of rubble. The school where children had learned their lessons was a twisted frame. The church where families had worshipped was missing its steeple. The main street, which had been lined with shops and cafes, was now a path of destruction. Cars that had been parked along the curb were stacked on top of each other like toys. Trees that had been standing for 100 years were uprooted, their roots exposed to the sky. And everywhere there was debris, papers, clothing, furniture, photographs, the scattered remains of lives. The survivors began to sift through the rubble, looking for anything that could be salvaged. They found wedding albums, baby shoes, a favorite doll, a set of china. Each find was a small victory, a piece of the past that had survived the storm. But there were also the things that could not be replaced. A family Bible that had been passed down for generations, a handcrafted quilt, a child's first drawing. Loss was profound, but so was the resilience. Neighbors helped each other, sharing tools, food, and water. The Red Cross set up distribution centers for clothing and supplies. Volunteers from surrounding towns arrived with chainsaws, shovels, and food. The governor visited, walking through the wreckage, shaking hands, and promising state and federal aid. And slowly, the process of rebuilding began. It started with the basics, clearing the streets, restoring power, and ensuring that everyone had a place to sleep. Tents were set up in parks and public spaces. FEMA arrived to coordinate the long-term recovery. Architects and engineers offered their services to design safer homes, with basements and reinforced walls. The town council held meetings in a temporary building, and they made decisions that would shape Blackwell for generations. They decided to rebuild the school, but this time with a tornado shelter. They decided to widen the streets to make them easier for emergency vehicles. They decided to plant new trees, but this time they chose species that could withstand the wind. The psychological recovery took much longer. The survivors had to deal with the trauma of the event. They had nightmares, they flinched at thunder, they could not shake the sound of the roaring wind. The churches and community centers offered counseling services, and people gathered to talk, to share their experiences, and to support each other. There were memorial services for the dead, and the town held a ceremony to honor the rescuers and volunteers. The stories of heroism and sacrifice were told again and again, and they became a source of strength. The story of the man who had used his truck to block a collapsed wall, giving others time to escape. The story of the woman who had run into a burning building to save a child. The story of the neighbor who had shared his basement with a dozen people, all of them strangers. The months after the tornado were difficult. Winter came and the temporary shelters were cold and cramped. The rebuilding was slow, hampered by shortages of materials and labor. Some people decided to leave, unable to face the memories, the reminder of what they had lost, but most stayed. They had roots in Blackwell and they were determined to rebuild their town and their lives. They worked together and they grew closer. The tornado had destroyed their homes, but it had not destroyed their spirit. And so, the story of the Blackwell tornado is not just a story of destruction. It is a story of survival, of community, of the human will to endure. It is a story that continues to be told, in the way that the town lives on, in the way that the survivors remember, in the way that a generation of children were taught to respect the sky and to never ignore a warning. It is a story that reminds us of the power of nature, but also of the power of people. And it is a story that even now, decades later, can still bring tears to the eyes of those who lived through it, and can still inspire awe and humility in those who only hear about it. The recovery process stretched into the spring, and with it came a new rhythm of life for the people of Blackwell. The temporary shelters had become a makeshift community, with rows of cots and tents set up in the high school gymnasium and the local park. Families who had once been neighbors on quiet streets now shared meals in a communal dining hall, their conversations filled with plans for the future and memories of the past. The children, resilient in ways that adults could not always understand, played games among the cots, their laughter a surprising sound in a place so marked by loss. The Red Cross volunteers, many of whom had come from distant states, worked tirelessly, their faces weary but kind. They distributed blankets, hot coffee, and toiletries, but more than that, they offered a listening ear. They heard the stories that had been told 100 times, and they never grew tired of hearing them because each story was sacred. Winter that year was particularly harsh. Snow fell on the debris that still littered the outskirts of town, covering the destruction in a white shroud. The temporary shelters, though well-intentioned, were not built for the cold. The canvas tents leaked, and the portable heaters could barely keep the chill at bay. People huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and body heat. The elderly were the most vulnerable, and many of them were moved into church basements and the homes of relatives who had been spared. The town council, with help from the state, converted an old warehouse into a long-term shelter, but it was months before it was ready. In the meantime, the community learned to endure. They organized soup kitchens and coat drives. They repaired broken windows with cardboard and plastic. They did what they had always done. They took care of each other. One family, the Jacksons, had lost everything. The father, Robert, had been a farmer, and his land, his barn, and his house were all destroyed. He had no crop that year, no income, and no home. He spent the winter working construction, rebuilding the homes of others, earning just enough to keep his wife and 3 children fed. His wife Martha volunteered at the shelter, cooking and cleaning, and she never complained. Their children, ages 8, 10, and 12, went to school in a temporary building, a Quonset hut that smelled of dry dust and paste. They did their homework by kerosene lamp, the same lamp that had been their grandmother's. And at night, when the wind picked up, the whole family would wake and look at each other, listening. The sound of a storm made Martha's hands shake. Robert would hold her and whisper that they were safe, but he knew as well as she did that safety was an illusion. The tornado had taught them that. The school was rebuilt that spring, but not before a long debate at the town council. Some wanted to build it on the same site, a flat lot near the center of town, because that was where the children could walk from anywhere. Others argued for a new location, farther from the paths that the tornado had taken. In the end, they rebuilt on the same site, but they added something new. A tornado shelter, large enough for the entire student body and faculty, was built into the foundation. It was a concrete bunker with reinforced walls and a steel door, and it became a symbol of the town's commitment to safety. The children called it the cave. They practiced drills twice a month, filing down the stairs in single file, sitting on the benches with their heads between their knees. The teachers told them it was just a precaution, but the children knew better. They had seen what a tornado could do. They never forgot. The elderly sisters, Gertrude and Edna, recovered from their ordeal, though they never again felt safe in a closet. They moved in with a niece in Ponca City, and they gave their land to the church. The church, which had lost its steeple, used the land to build a memorial garden. They planted rose bushes and dogwoods, and they placed a stone plaque with the names of the 20 who had died. Gertrude and Edna visited every year on the anniversary of the storm. They would sit on a bench holding hands and they would pray. They prayed for the souls of the dead, and they gave thanks for their own survival. They did not speak much about that day, but when they did, they always said the same thing, that God had been with them in that closet. That they had felt a presence, a warmth, a peace that had carried them through the terror. Tom and Sarah, the young couple who had huddled in the bathtub, rebuilt their lives on the same lot. They built a new house, smaller and sturdier than the first, with a basement that doubled as a storm shelter. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and they told them the story of the tornado every year on the anniversary. They showed them the bathtub, which they had salvaged and kept as a garden planter. It was filled with petunias now, and it sat in the front yard, a monument to survival. Sarah still cried when the thunder rolled, but she had learned to breathe through it. Tom would hold her and they would go down to the basement where the children would play with flashlights and toys. They made it a game, a family ritual. They said that the tornado had taken everything, but it had given them something too. It had given them each other, and it had taught them what mattered. The young girl who had been found in the ditch, the one whose mother had died searching for her, was named Emily. She spent 3 weeks in the hospital, recovering from a concussion and a broken arm. When she was discharged, she was taken in by her aunt and uncle who lived in a neighboring town. She never returned to Blackwell. The memories were too painful. She went to therapy for years and she learned to talk about the storm, but she never fully healed. She became a meteorologist of all things. She said it was a way to face her fear. She studied the science of tornadoes and she worked for the National Weather Service, helping to issue warnings that saved lives. She never forgot the sound of the wind that day, and she never forgot her mother's voice calling her name into the darkness. She dedicated her career to making sure that no other child would have to experience that. The man who had used his truck to block a collapsed wall was named Frank. He was a mechanic and his hands were scarred from the debris he had pulled away. He was awarded a citation by the town, but he never talked about it. He said he had only done what anyone would have done. But the people who had been trapped under that wall knew better. They had seen him risk his life, had heard him shouting encouragement, had felt his hands pulling them free. They invited him to every family gathering, every holiday meal. He became a beloved figure in Blackwell, a symbol of the ordinary heroism that had emerged from the storm. He died in 1982, and his funeral was one of the largest the town had ever seen. The hearse was followed by a line of cars that stretched for miles, and people stood on the sidewalks, waving flags and weeping. The woman who had run into a burning building to save a child was named Margaret. She was a teacher, and the child was one of her students, a little boy who had been trapped in the rubble of his home. She had seen the flames from the street and she had run inside without thinking. She carried the boy out, her clothes on fire, her hair singed. She was treated for second-degree burns, but she never regretted her decision. She continued teaching for another 30 years, and every year on the first day of school, she told her students about that day. She told them that bravery was not about being fearless. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when you were scared. She became a legend in the school system, and the little boy she saved grew up to be a firefighter. He said he had chosen that career because of her. As the years passed, the town of Blackwell slowly transformed. The scars of the tornado were covered by new buildings, new trees, new lives, but the memory of the storm was never erased. It was embedded in the town's DNA, in the way people built their homes, in the way they checked the sky, in the way they passed down stories. The children who had survived the tornado were now adults, and they told their own children about that day. They described the green sky, the freight train sound, the eerie silence after it passed. They taught them where to go, what to do, how to stay safe. And those children in turn taught their children. The story became a legend, a cautionary tale, a source of pride. The Blackwell Tornado of 1955 was studied by meteorologists for decades. It was classified as an F5 on the Fujita scale, one of the most powerful tornadoes ever recorded. Its path was a mile wide, and its winds were estimated at over 300 miles per hour. It was a classic wedge tornado, the kind that meteorologists still use as a textbook example. The storm that day had formed from a supercell thunderstorm traveling from the southwest, and it had produced a family of tornadoes, but the Blackwell tornado was the most violent. Scientists analyzed the atmospheric conditions, the temperature gradients, the wind shear, and they learned from it. They developed better warning systems, better radar, better communication protocols. The disaster led to changes in how the National Weather Service issued tornado watches and warnings. It was one of the storms that prompted the creation of the original tornado watch system in the 1960s. The town itself became a case study in disaster recovery. FEMA and the Red Cross used the lessons from Blackwell to improve their response strategies. The building codes that were implemented after the tornado influenced construction practices across the Great Plains. The idea that every school should have a tornado shelter, that every home should have a safe room, that communities should invest in warning sirens, all of these were shaped by the experience of Blackwell. The town had paid a terrible price, but that price bought knowledge that saved lives elsewhere. There was a sense among the survivors that their suffering had not been in vain. They had become a cautionary example, a story that was told to engineers, to emergency managers, to students of the sky. The economic recovery was slow but steady. The grain elevators were rebuilt bigger and better with concrete silos that could withstand the wind. The main street was restored and new businesses opened. A hardware store, a diner, a bakery. The town had lost its shoe store and its pharmacy, but new ones took their place. The population dipped for a few years, but then it stabilized. People who had moved away came back drawn by the community they remembered. The tornado had destroyed their town, but it had not destroyed their ties. In fact, it had strengthened them. The shared ordeal had created a bond that nothing could break. The annual memorial service became a tradition. Every April on the anniversary of the storm, the church bells would ring at 6:45 in the evening, the time the tornado had struck. The town would gather in the memorial garden, and the names of the dead would be read aloud. A wreath would be laid, and a moment of silence would be observed. The survivors would stand together, some leaning on canes, others holding grandchildren. They would look at the sky and they would remember. For some, the tears were still close to the surface. For others, the grief had become a quiet companion, a part of who they were. The children, the ones who had not been born yet, would listen to the stories, and they would understand that they were part of something bigger than themselves. They were part of a story that began on a terrible day, but that had continued through love, through work, through hope. Decades later, in the early 2000s, a historian from the University of Oklahoma came to Blackwell to record oral histories. She interviewed the survivors and she collected their stories in a book. The book was called The Day the Sky Fell, and it became a bestseller in the state. It was used in schools to teach children about the power of nature and the resilience of the human spirit. The book included the story of Emily, who had become a meteorologist. It included the story of Frank, the mechanic. It included the story of Margaret, the teacher. It included the story of the sisters Gertrude and Edna and the story of Tom and Sarah. It included the story of the mother who had died searching for her daughter and the story of the little girl who had been found in a ditch. The book ended with a chapter on the rebuilding, and it closed with a quote from a survivor, an old man who had lived through the Dust Bowl and the tornado. He said, "The wind takes what it wants and it leaves the rest." But he said it with a smile because he knew that what the wind had taken was only the surface of things. What remained was the soul of Blackwell, and that soul was indestructible. The legacy of the Blackwell tornado continued to evolve. In 2005, on the 50th anniversary, a new monument was unveiled in the town square. It was a sculpture of a tornado twisting upward from a base of fractured stone. On the base were etched the names of the 20 victims, along with a line from the Book of Psalms. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The monument was surrounded by benches and people would sit there and think. They would look at the names and they would remember that those 20 people had been more than statistics. They had been mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, children. They had been neighbors and friends, and their stories were woven into the fabric of the town. As the years turned into decades, the survivors grew old and one by one they passed away. The last living survivor of the Blackwell tornado died in 2020 at the age of 98. She was a woman named Ruth who had been a teenager when the storm hit. She had been trapped under a collapsed wall and she had been rescued by a neighbor. She had never forgotten that moment and she had spent her life volunteering for the Red Cross. At her funeral, the church was filled with people who had heard her stories. The pastor read from the book that the historian had written and he spoke about the power of memory. He said that as long as the story of Blackwell was told, the people who had lived it would never truly die. And so the story continues. It is told in the classrooms where children learn about tornado safety. It is told in the National Weather Service where meteorologists reference the storm as a case study. It is told in the churches where the congregation prays for those who have lost their homes to the wind. It is told in the homes where parents hold their children a little tighter when the sky turns green. It is a story that belongs to Blackwell, but it also belongs to everyone who has ever felt the earth shake or the wind howl. It is a story that reminds us that we are fragile, that our structures can be torn away in an instant, but that we are also strong, that we can rebuild, that we can love and laugh and remember. And that is why even now when the sirens sound and the sky darkens, the people of Blackwell know what to do. They go to their basements and their shelters and they wait, they hold each other. And they know that no matter what comes, they will survive because they have done it before and they will do it again. And they will do it again. In the years that followed, the people of Blackwell learned that the wind does not forget. It returns as it always has, and it tests the strength of the human spirit. In the spring of 2013, a powerful storm system swept across Oklahoma, and the sirens in Blackwell wailed once more. The sky turned that familiar shade of green, the color of bruised hope, and the clouds began to rotate. This time, however, the town was ready. The shelters were stocked, the warnings were heeded, and the children knew exactly where to go. The tornado that formed that evening was a large one, an EF3 that carved a path just south of the town limits. It missed Blackwell by less than a mile, but the people felt its breath, felt the ground tremble under their feet. They stood at the edge of their basements, peering through small windows, watching the funnel dance across the fields. And when it passed, they emerged not with the shock of the unknown, but with the calm of the prepared. They had been tested and they had passed. The storm had not taken a single life in K County that night, and the local news credited the community's vigilance. But the survivors of 1955 knew that it was more than that. It was the memory of that April evening, burned into the collective consciousness, that had saved them. They had learned the lesson of the wind, and they had taught it to their children and their grandchildren. The children of Blackwell grew up with the story as a bedtime tale. They heard about the little girl who was found in a ditch, about the mother who searched until the end. They heard about Emily, who became a meteorologist, and about Frank, who rebuilt the engine of the town. They learned that the storm was not just a tragedy but a teacher. In the schools, tornado drills were conducted with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. The students would file into the hallways, kneel against the walls, and cover their heads. The teachers would remind them to stay calm, to listen, to trust the system. And the students would remember that their grandparents had once done the same thing, but without the sirens, without the warnings, without the knowledge that the sky could be read. The sky was a book, and the people of Blackwell had learned to read it. They could spot the signs, the sudden stillness, the eerie light, the roar that sounded like a freight train. They could feel the pressure drop, and they knew that it was time to move. As the decades passed, the town evolved. The grain elevators were replaced with modern facilities, the main street was repaved, and the old buildings were retrofitted to withstand the wind. The memorial garden grew, with new trees planted in honor of the victims, and the names on the monument weathered with age. The church bells still rang at 6:45 every April, and the town still gathered, but the crowd grew smaller each year. The survivors had become a living history, a link to the past that was slowly slipping away. But the stories they told did not fade. They were recorded in books, in documentaries, in the oral histories that were preserved in the library. The Blackwell Tornado became a chapter in the story of the Great Plains, a reference point for every discussion about severe weather. Meteorologists would fly into Oklahoma to study the supercell thunderstorms that formed over the same fields, and they would stop in Blackwell to pay their respects. They would stand at the monument, read the names, and imagine the terror and the triumph. The science of tornado prediction advanced rapidly after 1955. Doppler radar, which could detect rotation within a storm, was developed in the 1970s and became widespread in the 1980s. The National Weather Service implemented the modern watch and warning system, and the lead time for tornado warnings increased from minutes to tens of minutes. But the lesson of Blackwell was that even with all the technology, the most important factor was the human response. The sirens could sound, the phones could buzz with alerts, but if people did not take shelter, the warnings were useless. So the people of Blackwell took shelter. They drilled, they planned, they built safe rooms in their homes. The town became a model for emergency preparedness, a case study that was taught in disaster management courses across the country. FEMA sent teams to Blackwell to study the community's resilience, and the town's approach was replicated in other tornado-prone regions. It was a quiet revolution, a revolution of readiness. In the early 2000s, a new generation of meteorologists began to use machine learning to predict tornado outbreaks. They could analyze vast amounts of data, model the atmosphere with unprecedented accuracy, and issue warnings that were tailored to specific neighborhoods. But even as the technology evolved, the old stories remained relevant. The Blackwell tornado was used as a benchmark to test the algorithms. Could the system have predicted the storm? Could it have saved the 20? The answer was not simple. The storm was a statistical outlier, a rare combination of atmospheric conditions that defied easy prediction. But the data from Blackwell helped refine the models, and the models got better. And the people of Blackwell watched from their homes, sometimes skeptical, sometimes hopeful, as the forecasts improved. The town itself faced new challenges. The population, which had stabilized after the tornado, began to decline again in the 2000s. Young people moved to the cities looking for jobs and opportunities. The main street saw empty storefronts, and the school struggled to maintain enrollment, but the community adapted. They started a farmers market, a craft fair, a volunteer fire department that doubled as a social hub. They found new ways to connect, new reasons to stay. And they never forgot the storm. The monument in the square was not just a reminder of loss but a symbol of endurance. It stood at the center of the town, a twisted column of bronze and stone, and it drew visitors from all over the world. Tourists would stop on their way to the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, and they would read the names, and they would ask the locals about the day the sky fell. And the locals would tell the story because the story was theirs, and it was a gift they could give. One of those visitors was a young woman named Maria, who came to Blackwell in the summer of 2000. She was a graduate student in atmospheric science, and she was writing her dissertation on the long-term impact of historical tornadoes on community resilience. She spent a week in Blackwell, interviewing the descendants of survivors, walking through the memorial garden, and sitting in the library reading the old newspapers. She met a man named James, the grandson of Frank the mechanic. James was now the owner of the garage, and he still had the original tools that Frank had used to rebuild the first car after the storm. James showed Maria the tools, worn smooth from decades of use, and he told her that every time he worked on an engine, he remembered his grandfather's hands, strong and steady after all they had endured. Maria also met a woman named Clara, the granddaughter of Emily the meteorologist. Clara was a teacher at the elementary school, and she had a classroom full of students who drew pictures of tornadoes and practiced their evacuation routes. Clara told Maria that Emily had always said the sky was a friend, not an enemy, and that the key was to understand its language. Maria collected hours of recordings and she wrote her dissertation with a chapter dedicated to Blackwell. She argued that the town's resilience was not just a product of the disaster itself, but of the way the community had chosen to remember. The memory was not a burden but a guide. It taught them how to prepare, how to react, how to rebuild. It gave them a shared identity that transcended generations. Maria's dissertation was published, and it received an award from the American Meteorological Society. She was invited to speak at a conference in Norman, where she told the story of Blackwell to a room full of scientists. She ended her talk by saying that the wind would always be a part of life on the plains, but that the people of Blackwell had shown that the wind could be faced with courage, with knowledge, and with love. And when she finished, there was a long silence and then applause. The story of Blackwell did not end with that applause. It continued in the lives of the people who called the town home. In the spring of 2025, a new family moved into a house on the south side of town. They came from California, fleeing the wildfires, and they chose Blackwell because the cost of living was low and the community was welcoming. They bought a house that had been rebuilt after the tornado, though they did not know that at first. They painted the walls, planted a garden, and enrolled their children in the local school. The neighbors came to welcome them with casseroles and pies, and they told them about the storm. The new family listened, and they felt a strange connection to a past they had not lived. They understood that they were now part of a place that had been tested and that the test had made it stronger. They learned where to go when the sirens sounded, and they taught their children to listen for the roar. They became part of the story, and so the story continues as all true stories do. It is not a story with a neat ending because the wind does not follow a script. It comes when it comes and it takes what it wants. But the people of Blackwell have learned that the wind also leaves something behind. It leaves the memory of those who are gone, the strength of those who remain, and the promise that the town will rise again, no matter how many times it falls. The children who were born in the new century do not know the fear of the original storm, but they know the pride of belonging to a place that refused to be destroyed. They walk past the monument on their way to school and they touch the cold bronze names. They know that those names are not just history but family. They know that the sky is not to be feared but respected. And they know that when the sirens sound, they will go to the shelters and they will hold each other and they will wait. Because that is what the people of Blackwell do. They wait, they hold, and they survive. And they will do it again and again as long as the wind blows across the plains. The story of Blackwell is not a cautionary tale about the power of nature. It is a story about the power of the human spirit, the power of community, and the power of memory. It is a story that will be told as long as there are people to listen and as long as there is a sky to watch. And that is the end of this episode, but not the end of the story. The story never ends. It only waits for the next storm, the next survivor, the next telling. The sirens blared across Blackwell on a cloudless afternoon in late May of 2006. It was a test, the first Wednesday of the month, but the sound still made hearts skip. The new family from California had been in town for just over a year, and they had learned the drill. The mother, whose name was Alina, gathered her children and led them to the safe room in the basement. The father, Marcus, was at work on the other side of town, but he knew the children would be safe. As the sirens wailed, Alina's daughter, Lily, asked a question that had been on her mind since the neighbors first told them about the storm. She asked why the town had stayed. Why did people come back after something so terrible? Alina did not have a simple answer, but she told her daughter that the land was not just dirt and grass. It was stories. It was the place where her teacher's grandmother had watched the sky. It was the garage where a man named James still worked with his grandfather's tools. It was the garden they had planted in the soil that had been soaked with rain and grief and hope. Lily thought about that as the siren faded and the test ended. She thought about the names on the monument, the ones she had learned in school. She thought about the children who had lived through the storm and grown old and the children who had not lived at all. And she decided that she would stay too if she had to. Because the town was not a place you left, it was a place you carried. Later that summer, the town held its annual memorial service at the monument. It was the 81st anniversary of the Blackwell Tornado, and the crowd was smaller than it had been a decade earlier. Many of the survivors had passed on and their children had moved away, but those who remained gathered under the shade of the oak trees that had been planted in the 1950s. The mayor spoke and the high school band played and the names were read aloud. A young woman named Sarah, the granddaughter of the doctor who had the medical tent, stepped forward to lead the moment of silence. She was a nurse now, working at the clinic that had replaced the old makeshift hospital. She thought of her grandfather as she bowed her head, of the way he had never talked about the storm but had always kept a photograph of the tent in his study. The silence stretched for 1 minute too, and then the wind picked up, rustling the leaves. It was a gentle wind, warm and dry, and it felt like a hand on the shoulder. The moment ended and the people began to talk, sharing memories, sharing pie, sharing the quiet laughter that comes from knowing you have survived something together. In the autumn of that same year, a team of documentary filmmakers arrived in Blackwell. They were working on a series about natural disasters and human resilience, and they had heard about the town from a professor at the University of Oklahoma. The filmmakers spent a month in Blackwell, interviewing everyone who was willing to talk. They filmed the monument, the safe rooms, the library archives. They interviewed James, who showed them the tools and told them about his grandfather's hands. They interviewed Clara, who took them to the elementary school and showed them the evacuation drills. They interviewed Alina and Marcus, who told them what it was like to move to a town that had been defined by a single day. The filmmakers were struck by the calmness of the people, the matter-of-fact way they talked about the storm. It was not a wound that had healed, but a scar that had become part of the skin, something you touched without thinking when you remembered. The documentary premiered on a national network in the spring of 2027, and it brought a new wave of visitors to Blackwell. Tourists came to see the place they had watched on screen, to walk the streets where the camera had lingered. The local diner added a special menu item called the Tornado Burger, and the gift shop sold t-shirts with a map of the damage path and the words "I survived the Blackwell story." The town welcomed the attention, but it also guarded its privacy. The story was theirs, and they did not want it to become a cartoon. They wanted the visitors to understand that the monument was not a souvenir. It was a grave. The documentary also caught the attention of a billionaire who had made his fortune in cloud computing. He was a tornado enthusiast, a man who had chased storms in his youth and who had always been fascinated by the intersection of nature and technology. He contacted the mayor and offered to fund a new weather research center in Blackwell. The center would be built on the site of the old high school, which had been demolished years earlier. It would have state-of-the-art radar, a small museum, and a training facility for emergency managers. The town council debated the offer for months. Some argued that the center would bring jobs and prestige. Others worried that it would commercialize the tragedy. In the end, they accepted, but with conditions. The museum would be free to the public. The exhibits would be curated by local historians. And the center would be named after the 20 who died, a permanent reminder that behind every data point there was a human life. The center opened in the summer of 2028, and its first director was a young meteorologist who had been inspired by Maria's dissertation. She stood at the podium on opening day and looked out at the crowd, and she saw the faces of people who had lost everything and built everything again. She spoke about the wind, about the science of prediction, about the limits of technology. And then she read the names one by one from the monument outside. The reading took almost 10 minutes, and when she finished, there was a silence like the one that had fallen over the town 83 years earlier, only this time it was not filled with dust and fear. It was filled with reverence. The center began its work, and it quickly became a hub for research on tornado climatology. Scientists from around the world came to study the data, to model the storms, to improve the algorithms. But every study, every paper, every breakthrough was framed by the knowledge that the wind did not care about human ambition. It only cared about the physics of the atmosphere, and the people of Blackwell knew that better than anyone. So the story of the Blackwell tornado is not a story that can be finished. It is a story that is written in the land, in the bone, in the way a parent holds a child when the sky turns green. It is a story that belongs to the wind as much as it belongs to the people. And it will be told again in the spring of some year not yet written, when a new family moves into a house on the south side of town and the neighbors come to welcome them with casseroles and pies, and they tell them about the day the sky fell. And the family will listen, and they will learn, and they will become part of the story, because that is what happens on the plains. The wind comes and the wind goes and the people endure, and the story never ends.